We've been in the book of Deuteronomy for several months, and even though we haven't quite finished it as a church family, we're going to pause after this teaching and transition into an extended focus on some one another phrases. Particularly in the New Testament, there are a lot of passages in the New Testament that have the phrase one another, and we're going to take the coming weeks and months to focus on that phrase. But now I want to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 27 and how, even though this is a practice from thousands of years ago that we are going to read about, I think it has a lot of relevance for today and a lot of relevance in everything that's going on in our world. And so this teaching is for March 22nd. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 2 through 8. I'll start with verse 2. When you have crossed the Jordan into the land the Lord your God is giving you, set up some large stones and coat them with plaster. Again, some context as we've been going through this book for months. This is an ancient text from thousands of years ago. And the context is right before they were going to enter into the land. Moses was reminding them, even though he ended up not going into the land, he was reminding them of who they were, who God is, and some things to remember to do as they enter into this land that's been promised to them, that they've been waiting a very long time to enter. So they're set free from slavery. It's been almost 40 years. Almost no one is remaining from the original crew that was set free. A whole new generation is going into this land. And so there are several things that they need to do to remember who they are, where they've come from, who God is, what God has done. And one of them is, when they enter the land, to set up large stones and coat them with plaster. So this is a classic example of when we're reading scripture and we kind of go, what does that have to do with now? What does that have to do with today? Are we supposed to do that? And as we've been going through this book, we've been talking about the spirit of the law. What is the heart behind it all? What's the spirit of it all? How do we observe these things, even though these were commands given to ancient people at an ancient time? Well, let's start with large stones. Large stones. What are they? How big is big? Well, historians believe these are big, upright, monumental stone slabs. These are pillars. These are huge. Remember the Come Thou Fount song? Here I raise mine Ebenezer. This is the Ebenezer. I raise this huge stone as a memorial, as a remembrance. This big thing. And let's just say you're wandering in the woods and you come across a big stone that you know had to have been placed there. It isn't laying on the ground, but is upright. You would know someone did that on purpose. And so it's one thing to have something on purpose. It's another thing to know what the purpose is. And so to coat these upright stones with plaster, there's something else. There's a covering of this. And so the plaster, this is a pretty common, from what we know, it was a known or common, somewhat common ancient Near Eastern procedure where they would coat a big pillar of stone with plaster and then they would write something to make it really stand out. And there's something called the Balaam inscription that's found in Jordan even today, and it's written on plaster. And so as you go into this land, when you've crossed the Jordan, it's a whole new generation of people. Do something, set something up as a remembrance. You've gone through all this stuff. You've gone through slavery. You've gone through freedom. You've gone through wandering. And now as you enter in, do something as a specific, strong remembrance of the thing that you've gone through. And so verse 3 says, write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. And when you have crossed the Jordan, set up these stones on Mount Ebal, as I command you today, and coat them with plaster. So they're to enter the land. set up these huge pillars, these huge Ebenezers, these huge stones, these large stones, set them up as some sort of memorial or remembrance so that it will pop. It will be noticed. Coat them with plaster and write on them all the words of this law. So there's a question: is what is that? What are all the words of the law? Is this all the entire Old Testament? No, it couldn't be, because the entire Old Testament hadn't been written yet. Oral culture at this point, very little writing, and so we're not to think that there was a bound Bible at this time yet. So what is all of the law? Well, some scholars believe maybe this is referring to all the laws that had just been spoken leading up to this. So this is chapters 12 through 16 possibly, which obviously wouldn't have been referred to as chapters 12 through 16 at the time. This was just part of an extended teaching of Moses, a series of sermons possibly, or one long sermon. So chapters 12 through 16, all the laws that were just spoken leading up to chapter 27, possibly. It could be referring to the whole book of Deuteronomy, or the whole book of Deuteronomy leading up to when this was said, possibly. One historian says, just so that we understand how large these stones must have been, one historian says that two of these stones that would be set up in this way, these big pillars that are covered with plaster, could be big enough to hold more than the entire text of all the book of Deuteronomy. So just so we kind of picture how big those are. So the whole book of Deuteronomy could be contained, and more, on these stones. When you think of two stones with the laws, or the law, you might immediately think of the 10 Commandments, right? So you have these tablets with the 10, or the fullness of what was spoken on Mount Sinai from the book of Exodus. This is bigger. This is not Moses coming down from the mountain to say, this is what God said. This is more than that. This is extended laws. This is beyond that, with huge pillars, with more. And so writing down the law on something bigger than tablets, it's a visual demonstration of an expansion of the teaching of God beyond the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. It's also a way to inscribe something, right? It's different. Talking about it's one thing, but to inscribe it is another thing. It kind of makes it stick, right? It's big, and you stand it up, and it's to remember something. But what is it to remember? What are you supposed to remember? Well, that's why you cover it with plaster and you write on it. So what you have is really a concrete image of an idea of the text. It is making it larger than life, so to show how important it is. And it's interesting in the culture we live in now, when something is larger than life, or larger than actual, we ascribe more authority and more power to it. There's an author that wrote a book called Flickering Pixels. Shane Hips wrote a book called Flickering Pixels. And I think he was a COO, or he was a leader for Porsche, and then he became a pastor and a teacher and an author. And he talked about church culture, modern church culture, in particular kind of mega church culture, where there are images of someone on a stage, on a screen. And so you can be standing in a room, or sitting in a room, and there's a person right there on the stage, but then they video that person, and then they make it even bigger on a screen, that people actually would prefer to look at the screen, even though they have the very person right there that they could look at. And one of the reasons is that they preferred that is because that person is larger than actual. And whether it be the teacher, or whether it be a musician or something, if the person is larger than actual, then it's perceived to have more authority. It's perceived to be more right or stronger. And so our culture today has kind of learned that if it's on a screen, especially if that screen is bigger than normal, than actual, then somehow that person is more right and more worth listening to. I also find it kind of interesting for me to make that point, knowing that this is being recorded, but it's going on your phone or an iPad, or maybe you're watching this on TV or a laptop or something like that. It's not necessarily meant to be projected bigger than if you were kind of sitting here in my backyard with me. But these images, these pillars, are a concrete image of an idea, of a text. When you go into this land, you set up these larger than life stones, cover them with plaster, write on them all the words of the law. Make the law that's been spoken big. Remember it. Don't just remember it here. Don't just remember it here. Don't just talk about it. Write it down and make it big so that we remember just how important this is. Verse 5 says, build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them. And so what you have here is possibly different stones. These might be the same stones, and these stones that are big with plaster with words on them are for remembrance of the law, but then there's also stones that are made for an altar. So if you were to build an altar with the stones, you're probably not talking about the stones as significant as these big stones. Nonetheless, we really don't know how big they would be, but these might be a little bit more regular. An altar of stones. Place these stones. Build an altar unto the Lord, right? And an altar would be a place of prayer. An altar would be a place of sacrifice, offering to God, thanking God for all that's being provided. A very special, holy place for worship. But why wouldn't they use any tool on them? That's an interesting add-on. Do not use any iron tool. Do not wield iron over them, one translation says. An iron tool. Now this could draw us back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, that says, and you should make me an altar of stones, and you shall not build them of hewn stones. You shall, for your sword, you would brandish over it and profane it. And so this iron tool is translated in Exodus in some English translations as sword. But it doesn't make much sense to think that they would be ironing out stones with a sword. And so the English translation from Tyndale in the early 16th century uses tool, uses sword, and so you have this combination of the word sword connecting with the word tool, and in the Hebrew the word is herev, and it means kind of sword, but most likely because they wouldn't be using an actual sword to do this, that's not the tool that they would use. By saying the word sword here, some rabbis have thought that this is meant to be kind of a metaphor, a stand-in for what they really think this is referring to, which is a chisel. So a sword, don't use a sword to it. But it probably meant more like the tool of a chisel. And so there's a rabbi that I've actually mentioned a couple times recently, an 11th and 12th century French rabbi, Rashi. And so he kind of caught the implication here. This word that's translated as sword, but wouldn't have been a sword, it would have been a chisel. And Rashi, being this great teacher, he says that the altar is interesting tension on purpose. The altar was actually created for life. The altar was created to lengthen a man's days, is what he said. And then iron, or a sword, was created to shorten a man's days. And so this altar is actually something that was supposed to be a regular part of life. It's supposed to be something that is a cycle of life. It's a thing that we do, that they would do on a regular basis. It's something that was a symbol of life, a symbol of worship, a symbol of holiness. And a sword would be kind of the opposite. It would be a symbol of death. Instead of life, it'd be a symbol of murder. And Rashi says it's not fit that the means of shortening should be brandished over the means of lengthening. Meaning, it's not right that this tool that's actually meant to destroy you would use to create something so beautiful. And so most likely it would have been referring to a chisel. So it's build an altar out of stones to the Lord. Build an altar to the Lord, your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them. So it could be just generic iron tool, could be don't use a sword, or it could be metaphorically don't use a sword, don't kill it, don't chisel it. Most likely it would have been referring to an actual chisel, but the essence of this is don't hurt it, don't kill it. Well, it's just a rock. It's just a stone, right? But if you take this imagery further, and we realize that New Testament implications of this is that these stones that are built up as an altar, built up as a temple, built up as a house of God, this place of worship, these are living stones, right? 1 Peter chapter 2, Christ being the living stone, this foundational corner piece, this chief cornerstone, and that humans are living stones. And also that we are living stones that actually are living out this practice of worship. And Romans chapter 12 talks about us being living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. That's our spiritual act of worship. So we're living stones, and this is an act of worship for us to be building an altar, and we actually are the altar. We are stones. So if you take this imagery of actual stones and don't chisel them and don't kill them with a sword, don't change them into something else before you bring them. Just bring them as they are, however you find them in the field, and place them on the altar just like they are, because my sisters and my brothers, we know this. When you try to chisel someone in order to make them shaped into what you want them to be, it's like you're killing them, right? You find them in the field as they are, and you say, come, let us worship God together. And then you take an iron tool to them and try to change them into something else before they are even brought into the place to build the altar. It's like you presented to them life, but you actually were lying, and that you presented to them death instead. So we must remember that these stones are placed in the field, they're laying in the field, and they are ready to become an altar together. They're meant to be living stones, to be an altar and a place of worship as living sacrifices. We, my sisters and my brothers, we are the stones, and we are the altar, and we are the house of God that is being built. Well, Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 6, we'll finish with verses 6 through 8. Verse 6 says, build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones. So that's what I was referring to, just laying around with field stones, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. And so you have this altar from field stones just laying around. Don't chisel them. Don't change them into something else before they're brought in. Believe that the way that they were laying there actually fits together already. Do you feel that? That we're not to find the stones and then actually try to carve them into shape so that we can sort of fit them together like the puzzle pieces that we think that they should be, but believing that they are laying in the field, and whatever is laying in the field is brought together to build an altar, and that altar is already prepared perfectly. It's already ready to be fit together into this altar, or into this house, this temple. Sacrifice fellowship offerings there. I love that. Fellowship offerings. Some of the offerings were just to be one with God. There's so many times that our prayer and our worship and our coming to God and our requests have to do with somehow getting power, receiving power, getting some sort of answer, having something happen that we want to happen, but there's an entire aspect of worship that is not about requesting something from God that God would do, but simply being in fellowship with God and one another. The priests that we all are, the priests getting together and saying, this is meant to be about fellowship. This is meant to be about oneness. This isn't about receiving power and getting things. This is about the very presence of God that we're becoming more and more aware of. So sacrificing fellowship offerings, they're eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. So it wasn't food thrown up to God that you hope God catches and eats. It's food that's offered as an offering unto the Lord for the sake of fellowship, but actually eaten together and rejoicing together, believing that as the priests are eating these things together, that they're also in the very presence of God, in the midst of the fire that God is so often compared to. And verse 8 says, and you shall write very clearly all the words of this law on these stones you have set up. Write clearly all the words of this law on these stones that you have set up. And so this is possibly a combination. These huge pillars covered in plaster as memorials with all the law, and field stones arranged as an altar with the law written on that as well. So what do we do with that? In the midst of all that's going on in the world, in the midst of the fact that this is a completely different culture than when this was written, I think it's time now more than ever for a building campaign. I've talked about this, kind of joked about this for years. And it's not even really a joke. I mean it. We need a building campaign. It's just that we need that to be defined differently. We are building something. We are being built into something. This is a capital campaign of people. We need to remember that as we build and are being built, that we pick up the field stones as they are, inviting people in to become the altar, inviting people in to realize that they are the altar, inviting people into this holy and this sacred togetherness and this fellowship of being one with God and being one with one another. And so here's an idea. In the midst of this hopefully temporary thing we're in, where we're really not supposed to be too close to each other physically right now, this social distancing that we have for the sake of safety, for the sake of health. What if, until you can connect with more people physically, and hopefully you're connecting with people online, hopefully you are still in relationship with people, and one of the things that we wanted to remind you of is that you have a family and you can reach out to us. You can go to theHeart.us and you can see all that's going on. We have added several things as a resource for people in the midst of all that's going on. We want to be kind of a centralized place where if you are in need, you can let us know, and we'll kind of consolidate all those needs, and you can fill out a form and you can let us know all that's going on that you have need for. You can also let us know if you're willing to help meet the needs of people, and you can give towards us trying to meet the needs of those people. So in the midst of all this, we're still together, right? I've said this several times. I'll probably just keep saying it over and over again, is that church is not canceled because we are the church. We're not having large group gatherings. We are currently having our spiritual formation groups and other friend groups. They're meeting online, whether that be on Google Hangout or Zoom or whatever it is. That there's all sorts of different ways to do that. But until we can actually be closer together physically, until we can actually be back in living rooms, until we can actually get back to the place where we gather humans together and we put our arms around one another and we remind each other of who we are. We remind each other of how we are loved both by God and by us. Here's an idea. What if we picked up some rocks, go outside, pick up some rocks and pretend they're people? Because it's a bit silly, but it's not that much of a stretch, right? We see a lot of example of this. 1 Peter chapter 2 that I mentioned, that we're like living stones. Go outside, pick up some rocks, pretend they're people, and write on them, and build an altar. And write, maybe you're not going to write all of the law. You could just write the word, or the phrase, the law, or all of the law. Or you could write something else. What if you wrote on the stones something that's a reminder to you of the ways of God? If you wrote something on them that reminded you of who God is, reminded you of what God has done, reminded you of the nature and character of God, reminded you of the nature and character of yourself in light of God in you. What if you wrote something, some word or words, or maybe an image, if you're more of an artist, and draw something abstract that is a reminder to you of the ways of God, the spirit of the law. And build an altar and place that stone on an altar until we're able to do that with people again, physically. Do it with some rocks. And to the best of your ability, continue to do that with your actions, with supporting one another emotionally, spiritually, financially. Continue to meet with one another as a family, even if it needs to be virtual. Please let us know if you are in need. Please let us know if you're able to contribute to those in need. But I think the main thing that I want to say regarding this passage in Deuteronomy, and I guess for now, the close of our several-month extended teaching on Deuteronomy, is that as we go through the fields collecting the field stones, as we find these big pillars as well, we need to put down the chisel. We need to believe that all people are made in the image of God, and that doesn't mean that they are perfect. It doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that they actually don't need to make some changes. It means that we are not to present to them an invitation of life and in the meantime be killing them. And so, may you believe these things about God, and may you also believe these things about yourself, and may the Lord bless you and keep you and be gracious to you and turn His face towards you, shine His fire on you and grant you with peace. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.